Hola, comrades. Today's topic of interest, Final Fantasy IV. This was the game that changed everything. Unlike other art forms, such as novels or film, which were born out of the fusion of new philosophical and technological advances, with the great aching emotion that has coursed through humanity since the days of the earliest civilizations, gaming was born out of the synthesis of technology and the desire to entertain oneself while sitting all day at a computer working on a menial task one would rather ignore. Early gaming produced such narrative masterworks as Pong, a game about knocking a ball back and forth, and Super Mario Bros., a game with all the raw storytelling complexities of a 5-year-old hopped up on sugar. The early games were in arcades, and arcade owners didn't want players to experience a grandiose narrative. Why would they? They wanted players to spend some quarters to experience some addictive gameplay. They would get hooked and return to the arcade the next day with another fistful of quarters to see if they could get further. What's the point of crafting a decent story when the vast majority of players won't get to the end of the game? Even after the art form moved to home consoles, the tradition of prioritizing gameplay over story continued. Gaming was not taken seriously by the critics because it did not take itself seriously. The intention was to provide the gamer with some fun times, not to make a serious impression on them. However, the move to consoles opened up new avenues for game development that would lead to the rise of storytelling in gaming. New genres were available to developers, as the object of a game was not to shake as many quarters as possible out of a gamer's pocket, but rather to provide the gamer with a satisfying enough experience that they would come back for more in the future. The Legend of Zelda, for instance, would not have worked as an arcade game. It's too slow, too reliant on atmosphere at the expense of quick and easy payoffs. It's not about that cheap, visceral excitement. It's about slow indulgence, enjoyed over the course of dozens of hours. It's about a gently rising and simmering sense of accomplishment. However, despite Zelda's brilliance, it is not what transformed the concept of narrative in gaming. No, for that we have to examine another genre forged in the fertile ground provided by console gaming, the role-playing game. This genre got its name from how it allowed players to slip into the roles of actual, developed characters, rather than merely taking control of a blank slate like Mario or Link. With actual characters comes conflict, tension, relationships, and character development, i.e. the building blocks of narrative. That said, these early RPGs were not significantly more complicated narratively than the likes of Mario Bros. Or Mega Man. In the early Final Fantasy games, the stories boiled down to a group of thinly defined heroes flying around the world on an airship to defeat the big bad. But Final Fantasy IV changed that. It charted a new course for the series, and in doing so inexorably changed gaming. The protagonist, Cecil Harvey, which sounds more like the name of a mediocre television personality than an RPG protagonist, but I digress, changes drastically throughout the course of the game. Though beginning as a Dark Knight, his internal conflicts and the pressures of a job he increasingly considers unjust, as well as his love for his childhood friend Rosa, lead him to a dramatic transformation that culminates in one of the best scenes in the game, and one of the best scenes in the entire franchise, in which he becomes a paladin. Cecil starts fresh at level 1, for he is broken from his old life and his old destiny, and become a different man.
No other road remains. The time's come. Bid farewell to your blood-stained past. Forsake the darkness you once embraced, or the light will find no hold. Vanquish the Dark Knight. You and he are one, no more. two of him!
What's happening? Vessel, look out!
Stay back. This is a fight for me and me alone. My atonement for all the sins I've wrought, my test. And one I do not mean to fail.
Your virtue is proven. I will instill you now with hallowed light, formed of my very soul. May it be your strength, though it be the last of mine. My son, you must stop Goldberg.
This is a far step beyond the characterization present in the earlier games, and what's better is that he isn't the only substantial character in this game. There's Cain, Cecil's other childhood friend, who's also in love with Rosa, and thankfully the love triangle between the three of them isn't overtly tedious. Cain isn't an excellent character, but he's ambitious and confused and sarcastic, and a far cry from the banal and bland characters of video games, even RPGs, considered acceptable before Final Fantasy IV. The same can be said of Rosa herself, as well as Rydia and Atella, though none of these characters belong in the same category as Auron or Yuna or Kefka or Terra, or even Squall and Rinoa from Final Fantasy VIII. They demonstrated a daring in this game that was not exhibited by its peers, a willingness to demand investment from the player in actual people with personalities and dreams and fears and hopes and dreads and desires, instead of blank slates that they can insert themselves into effortlessly. Final Fantasy IV had the audacity to demand empathy, to dare gamers to move beyond rank egotism. In a game where the protagonist is a blank slate, a guffawing, self-aggrandizing gamer can boast that they killed a monster or fought against an evil empire. With a story-driven RPG, however, the gamer is forced to take a more mature, detached perspective and admit that they are playing through the life of a different person with a different countenance and different ideals and a different way of looking at the world. Now, I should clarify that RPGs were not the first genre to introduce narrative to gaming. Before, there were text adventure games and point-and-click adventure games, but the stories they told were not comparable to what was achieved with Final Fantasy IV. More pertinently, they were not infusions of narrative into gaming, but rather instances of narrative being awkwardly squeezed into unrelated and insipid gameplay. They were more akin to visual novels than actual games. Final Fantasy IV changed that. It not only proved that games could feature a great narrative, but that this narrative could be seamlessly interwoven with the monster battling and the item collecting. This was nothing less than a coup. Before, gaming had been about simple enjoyment. It had been a distraction, nothing more than a diversion from more serious matters. Final Fantasy IV wrested it away from that ignominious tradition and directed it toward a more luminous path, one that would lead it to respectability and cultural importance. This isn't to say Final Fantasy IV was a fantastic game. It's more notable for the tradition it helped start than for its merits as a game. Yes, it is by far the most compelling of the first 5 Final Fantasies, which is why it was the only one of those 5, with the exception of the first game, to be released outside of Japan in good haste. It holds up today, and if you haven't played it before, I recommend the DS remake, which updates the original game with cleaner graphics and gameplay while staying true to the spirit of the original. It's much better than the average piece of AAA junk that's going to be released this year, I'll say that much. However, as an expert on narrative, I must criticize this game's haphazard, clunky contrivances. Characters die throughout the story, but few stay dead. They're revealed to have escaped somehow, or survived through some other narrative artificiality. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with bringing a character back to life. When it's done respectfully and soberly, it can introduce a new dynamic that can force other characters to react and adjust, making for solid drama. However, when it's done sloppily, it acts like a crutch for untalented writers who haven't the skill to create more compelling tension, and the entire work takes on the pallid pompousness of a soap opera. Worse yet is the game's obsession with twists, the worst of which being near the end of the game, when the imposing, intimidating villain Golbez is revealed to have been controlled by a lunar monster, and then, yes, you have to go to the moon. This isn't quite as bad as the villain of Final Fantasy V being a giant tree, but it is a more profound disappointment. If you're a writer, or you have aspirations to become one, learn from this. A narrative is a precious thing, and it can be easily crushed by poor decision-making and a lack of restraint. If the story is not served in terms of character and theme, by having the heroes suddenly go to the moon, don't have the heroes suddenly go to the moon. Drastically shifting scale and tone can leave the smaller adventures feeling thin and unimportant, or, even worse, leave the more grandiose spectacles feeling overwrought and unnecessary. Unfortunately, later Final Fantasies would not learn from the mistakes of this game. 8 and 9 are particularly striking in terms of abandoning the interesting, character-driven struggle they had steadily and intricately constructed in favor of wacky comic nonsense. 10 is my favorite Final Fantasy game by far for manifold reasons, including its impeccable structure, its subversive intelligence, and its desire to drive its characters to the point of questioning their entire worldview, but it also never indulged in melodramatic revelations that serve no purpose other than to shock. It doesn't play tricks. It doesn't ratchet up the gravitas for no good reason. The stakes are clear from the beginning. To paraphrase what great American playwright Arthur Miller once said about The Bicycle Thief, it gets truer and truer as it goes along, not cleverer and cleverer. The revelations are played with a determined naturalism that serves to make them all the more devastating. When a piece of information is revealed, the revelation is not random, but rather quickly takes on the trappings of inevitability. It's absolute genius. But, this game is genius too. Its genius is just on a smaller scale. It's not a marvel of its medium that will demand academic studies for centuries to come, but it is a deft and thoughtful game that proved that gaming can tell evocative, worthwhile stories, as well as film or literature. The likes of Cecil and Kane have endured, even as the whole of the first 3 games of the series has faded into obscurity, and for good reason. This isn't just a good story for a video game, as they used to say when gaming was less respected. This is just a plain good story with plain good characters in a plain good world, and because of that, it endures. Have you ever thought about what Final Fantasy would look like through the lens of the world's great film directors? No? Is that only me? Whatever. Regardless of the popularity of this fantasy, its richness is glorious. Imagine Final Fantasy VI, directed by Kubrick, or Final Fantasy VIII, directed by Truffaut, or Final Fantasy X, directed by Cuarón. The hypotheticals are immense in number and enthralling in appeal. For Final Fantasy IV, I'd love for an animated adaptation by the underrated Mamoru Hosoda, an ambitious Japanese filmmaker with preternatural skill at composing these thematically dense films that are utterly sprawling in time and space, with these heartfelt, aching, haunted characters. But enough tangential warbling. Final Fantasy IV is a romantic epic about light and darkness, the strains of responsibility, and the burden of breaking free from prior conditioning. It's a stirring, elevated work that I can almost imagine displayed beside 16th century Baroque paintings in the Louvre. Gratuitous fake-outs and space travel aside, it's a wonderful game. Square Enix should make more games like it. And no, I don't mean nonsensical garbage like the After Years, which is almost exactly the same as the original game and yet somehow also a million times worse. But I digress. If you liked what you saw today, consider donating to my Patreon so I can produce even more magical content. Unfortunately, I cannot make sure that the Final Fantasy games they make in the future are good, no matter how much money you give me. Also, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, all that fantastical stuff. Adios, comrades!